Hello, everyone. Bienvenidos a todos. Thank you for joining the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs for this installment of Chatting with MCLA. My name is Samantha Diaz, and I am the Legislative and Policy Director in the area of education. Today, our focus for this conversation surrounds distance learning and its impact on our community. We have a powerful group of panelists with us who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience, and honestly are doing incredible work in their respective corners of the education sphere. We have Jennifer Godinez, Associate Director of the Minnesota Education Equity Partnership, without getting tongue-tied, also known as MNEEP. Katie Aviña, she is the Executive Director of El Colegio High School, and Antonio Cardona, the Director of Pillsbury United Communities Office of Public. Thank you all for taking the time to be here with us at MCLA today. But before we jump in, just to go over the structure of the conversation for all the folks that are joining us, we do have a prepared set of questions that will guide our discussion. During this time, though, as the conversation continues to take shape, if folks want to ask questions, please feel free to send them in the chat. We will save the final, hopefully at least 10 minutes to respond to as many of those questions as possible. I certainly appreciate your patience with us as we at MCLA are continuing to learn and work through the best way to host these WebEx events. So we're gonna try to get to as many questions as possible. So in moving on to our fantastic group of panelists, it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about who you are and your organization. Let's start with.
We didn't hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. How about just who you are, what you do, and a little bit about your organization?
You want me to, who, anyone should start?
Oh, yeah, you. I'm sorry, Jennifer.
That's the part I didn't hear. I was like, this is my
Yep, my apologies.
That's okay. Hi, I'm Jennifer Godinez, and very glad to join everybody today. Buenas tardes. Gracias por estar con nosotros a escuchar esta plática. I am Jennifer Godinez. I'm the Associate Executive Director of the Minnesota Education Equity Partnership. And on a personal note, I want to say I'm the daughter of Mexican immigrants, and definitely got my education through our family's hard work, and everybody who understands the Latino community that we cross borders and we do a lot of things in this country in order for our children to succeed. I feel like I'm the product of that, and also my community. With that said, I work with MNEEP to address research policy issues related to the opportunity gaps in our communities. And so we use a race equity lens to really look at how the educational system has created barriers, and they're historic and they're continuous. As we know now with COVID-19, they've been getting deeper. And so MNEEP is really about understanding the research, understanding what our communities are saying, and shaping new policy practices and narratives in order to close the opportunity gap.
Antonio?
Great. Thank you. Antonio Cardona. I'm the Director of the Office of Public Charter Schools at Pillsbury United Communities. Pillsbury is a 140-some-year-old nonprofit organization, multi-service, very deeply embedded in communities across not really just Minneapolis, but the Twin Cities in general. We've been a charter school authorizer for a couple decades. I've been here for about 15 years, and so we authorize 20 charter schools, really do it through a lens of trying to advance educational equity for our students and thinking about how we do two things at once, work at the ground level, but then also making higher level systems more responsive to our community needs.
Thank you. How about you, Katie?
My name is Katie Aviña, Samantha said. Buenas tardes, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you, Samantha, for inviting me to be a part of this. I just started at El Colegio as Executive Director this January. Otherwise, I have been 15 years at Academia Cesar Chavez in various roles. I'm excited to be here. I've always been very passionate about education in our Latino and our Latinx community, and that's what drives me. Our students are what drives me to be where I am, and I'm excited to now be at El Colegio.
Great. Thank you all again. So just shall we dive right in here? So Katie, I think we'll start with just getting a little bit from your perspective of how has this crisis affected your organization's operations and your relationships with your stakeholders, so your students and your families.
Yeah, so it's been hard, right? There's some good things, there's some challenges, and we've all been learning to adapt. As I said, I just started at El Colegio in January, so I really feel like as I was new to the community and just starting to get to know students and families, boom, everyone has to be out of the building. So it's definitely, it's been a challenge, but what's beautiful is that everyone here at El Colegio really pulls together, and we're really trying to think creatively on how we can be in constant communication and using our best practices that we know that work with our families and with our students. So as we reflect, and every day it feels like looking at how we're doing with our distance learning, it's hard because we are not seeing all of our students show up to the live meets. So we feel like we're not in that face-to-face communication with our students, and especially as teachers, they're like, are they okay? What's going on? How are we not reaching them? But then on the flip side, we're calling our families every day, especially to those who didn't show up to a meet, but then we're also calling our families and seeing who for that week needs food, who needs food dropped off, or maybe they need diapers, or maybe they need some type of other basic needs, right? Because they've lost their work, or maybe they need help calling Clues, maybe they need help calling Navigate. So we're also at the same time in a constant communication that maybe we weren't as in much when we were all physically here, right? So that part is exciting, and even though it can be sad when we're hearing the situations of our families, but we're in that communication and we feel that they're trusting us, and so that informs me that we're doing something right. Weekly, when we do drop-offs, we go to about 70 different homes, and so then we're able to even see sometimes face-to-face our students. So I feel like we're in a connection with them on that social emotional or meeting those needs. And I think we're also trying to hold ourselves to the high expectation. How can we also help them academically? Our students, you know, they reach out and they'll call me and they're like, I really want to get caught up on X class. How do I do this? You know, so that shows me they trust us. They're reaching out for help. They know who to call. And it's like, you're communicating. That's the best thing you can do. Let's start there and let's take one thing at a time and get through it together. And it's beautiful because all of the teachers here at El Colegio are like, yes, let's do it. How can we be creative? How can we be flexible? You know, us as the administration and other support staff will help meet those other needs. And then the teachers working and being as flexible as possible during this hard time. So it's, you know, when I was reflecting on this question, it's like sometimes I feel we're doing a really great job. We're communicating, we're talking, and then we also know there's some of the students that maybe were struggling even when we were on site. We're seeing them struggle even more, and it's hard because we have to like go out and find them versus at least they showed up to the building. So it's this constant revolving communication and reflective dialogue that me and the team are having on a daily basis.
So thank you for sharing that perspective. And switching gears to Antonio, a little bit of an interesting dynamic. Antonio is Katie's authorizer at El Colegio. So in thinking about how this in thinking about the pandemic response, or just the effects of how has your role as authorizer shifted at all in the accountability and, you know, how you're holding your schools accountable? What's that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that because, you know, I have kind of two layers of, you know, observation in this. You know, one is under Pillsbury United Communities, and that, you know, we are an active social service agency, and so thinking about what engagement with, you know, our standard community members, you know, look like has very much shifted. I think to Katie's point, you know, there's people that we're used to seeing, you know, almost on a daily basis, and now it's wondering, you know, are they okay? You know, what are the things that they need? You know, because our physical buildings are probably about 75% closed, but figuring out, you know, what does food distribution look like? How do we keep dinners open? emergency services, domestic violence things. So, it's been interesting for us to actively do it. And then on the other side, it's been interesting at the authorizer level to watch these 20 institutions navigate these issues themselves. And, trying to work actively to create kind of open communication, create forums where our charter school directors, board chairs can have conversations with each other, with us. We do a lot of verbal processing. We have weekly office hours calls where, there's a formal agenda, but it's really an opportunity for somebody to say, like, this is coming up, how are you thinking about attendance? What are you doing for graduation to honor your students? Are you doing the PPP loan? What is that? And so it's just been, a lot of thinking on your feet.
Jennifer, thoughts on how this has impacted your relationship or your stakeholder communications?
Sure. Like I was saying before with Manip, it's not necessarily direct service. We don't serve students, but as an intermediary with school districts and school communities, we actually have 5 major goals to transform education that we've been working on in our strategic plan, in our movement. We've been trying to address the teacher of color shortage, again, through convenings, public policy shaping, EML learners, emerging multilingual learners, thinking about school climate issues, and then college access and equity. And so with those issues, what we've done is we've pivoted and we've done a couple of town halls, virtual town halls, to gather input from educators and school leaders and families and students to let us know how they're dealing with distance learning. So we still feel like there's a race equity lens that we need to put, especially on how distance learning is actually impacting our school communities.
And to that point, Jennifer, certainly appreciate it. As certainly the panelists know, and some of the folks who are listening in, MCLA sent out a survey to community to enhance our understanding of the Latino experience with distance learning. While we're working on the final report on the quantitative data, the open-ended responses or the qualitative data demonstrates a continued need to improve communications with students and families, need to focus on social and emotional learning and those challenges, and need for support for families who are navigating through distance learning and using these systems for the first time. And so those are a couple of the themes that really rose up in the survey, in addition to the access to technology has been just consistent within the conversations that we've been having. So Jennifer, how does what we've been hearing, how does that align with what you've been hearing, seeing in your work, and what is bubbling up as greatest needs for your stakeholders as we continue to open respond to the pandemic?
Yep, they definitely parallel what you're talking about. And again, our organization is statewide, we're multiracial, we're very concerned also about the American Indian community during this time. And I think right away, I like how some leaders have said, overnight we had to turn into a distance learning or online type of educational system. And so the impact on that on everybody was very severe, as far as like not having hardware that they needed, whether that be their computers or connection to internet. Also just that Wi-Fi, the hotspots, and it wasn't just rural areas, but urban areas as well were missing. And then also that engagement, as Katie was saying, what they were used to in terms of school community being more engaging and really talking to students about what their needs were. That was a lot harder through distance learning from what we heard. So those are the types of things that we're very worried about, along with the social emotional learning kind of development that isn't happening at the highest level now with distance learning.
Katie, I'd like to shoot you the same question in terms of like some of the issues that have been shared with us over the past several months. How does this align with what you've been seeing, what you've been hearing, and what has been bubbling up? And just in knowing your work at El Colegio, just if you want to talk about a little bit of like how you guys are handling the social emotional learning component of it.
Yeah, how we're handling this. So one thing that we're doing too with the social emotional that I want to say is checking in with our staff. We do already, El Colegio is trauma informed, and so our practices are already, when we were here and we're carrying that out, checking in with their students, and we have our school therapist who's still working above and beyond checking in with her students and other students, but also, you know, just the other week we had an occupational therapist come and do some exercises with our staff just to help get us grounded and help us build our stamina, right? Because there's what she calls is that empathetic fatigue that we're all feeling because we're on like this go, go, go. We gotta. And teachers and educators, like that's their heart, like that's their passion, and they're gonna keep doing whatever they can do to meet the needs of their students, right? That's why they're in education and they're passionate about it. So I also wanted to like slow down and check and make sure we're all doing okay as well, so we can be out there. But I think too, we know that there's going to be a need now, and then especially coming fall, we need more than just our one therapist. You know, we need more than just our one social worker. Even though many of us are wearing several hats in a small charter school, we need more of that expertise as well to be supporting all of the needs of our students, because now it's just grown so greatly. So I think we're all conscious of that. I think we're trying to be creative on who we can work with in the community. And so but it's gonna cost something, right? You know, just like technology and hotspots, it was a need, like this is that next ramp of what we need to be prepared for as well as we continue on for the next few years. This is not gonna end, even when there's no normal coming back, you know?
Yeah. And shifting to Antonio, what have you, what has bubbled up as some of the greatest needs for the students within the PUC portfolio, but also, you know, the school and its leadership as they navigate through this?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think, I would just echo a lot, that Jennifer and Katie have talked about, because I think there has been, a shifting around what students are needing, not just academics, but all these other support services. And so, schools are having to act more like social service agencies. And so that's not something that, I mean, many of our schools do that, but not to the degree that I think is expected right now. You have to think about food delivery in a very different way. You have to be open to do childcare for first, frontline workers. You're getting a little more out and about as you're possibly driving around, learning packets and things like that. I think for us, our communication level has definitely had to change in terms of the ways that we work in collaboration with our school leaders. The role of an authorizer can be a very wonky one where it's hard to define what it is, and you kind of live in this evaluator space, and so it's a shift to move over into a space of more collaboration. We're more of a partner, asking what do you need, are there questions that we can help get you answered. And I think we've also had to step more into an intermediary role with the Minnesota Department of Education. So it's a lot easier for us to say, we're hearing this from our portfolio of directors, and so here's the few questions that are bubbling up. And so, being able to lean into our power more, that, an individual school leader may not have.
So I think that's a good segue to the next question. But actually, before we move on, I just want to reiterate to our attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat as the conversation is ongoing, because we'll save about like 10 minutes towards the end before wrapping up to answer some of those questions. So Antonio, in thinking about long-term impacts or that you foresee in the future, what should decision makers be mindful of as they continue to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic? Just a little bit about, like, from MCLA's perspective, we've worked really closely with Commissioner Ricker, who's been super communicative and really thoughtful and has listened to some of the concerns. But in saying that, what do these decision makers need to continue to be mindful of?
How much time do we got? So I mean, I think two things bubble up for me. One is the more immediate stuff of how we're going to have to deal with, essentially an extended summer slide, and what does that mean for student achievement. And then there's also this bigger question around what does schooling look like now and in the future. So I mean, I think I'll start with that thing. So just to give a little bit of a flavor of how we've been operating as an authorizer is, we firmly believe that charter schools have a duty to be innovative, creative, rethink what education needs to look like. And so I think even beyond charter schools, but traditional districts, I think, have been in the space for the last decade of what does innovation in the classroom look like. So one of the things that we've been working on a lot, we've been working hand in hand with the Bush Foundation around personalized learning and what does that look like for students. And the space that we come out of it is, for a long time, well-to-do, white kids have had access to schools that look a little bit different: Waldorf schools, Montessori schools, schools where they get like different, like tactile instruction and a lot of social emotional stuff. And so I think over the last number of years, people have started to implement personalized learning models in a much broader way. And so one of that is how that connects to physical spaces. So if you know what a personalized learning classroom looks like, there's a lot of like flexible seating arrangements to it. And so like many classrooms will have kind of three things happening at one time. You have the bulk of your kids who are, focused on the teacher getting direct instruction. And then you have a handful of kids that are, doing their individual, one-to-one devices or working on their own things. And then you might have a group of 3 to 5 kids that are getting more kind of intensive interventions. And then, the seating looks different. There's bean bags, they're clustered up with one another with their little Chromebooks. And so my fear is that, in our portfolios, a lot of schools that have high populations of low-income kids of color, that's been very successful for them to get that level of personalization. And so my fear is that as we, have to wrestle with how physical spaces are restricted, if I look at, some of the physical spacing guidance that's come out for summer enrichment, summer schools, it's very prescriptive in that, desks have to be 6 feet away from each other. They all have to be facing one direction. Hallways have to be, one way. And while I understand the necessity of doing that for safety purposes, we also have to live in the tension of how we think about implementation so that our kids don't lose that level of kind of like educational attention. And so then that goes back to the first thing around how we deal with, an extended summer slide, anticipating how we move into the fall where it's likely that, 100% of the kids aren't going to be able to be in the building. And so how do we create systems and controls where kids are still able to achieve?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, is it okay for me to go next?
Oh, yeah, please.
I was just going to say that I think we'd be remiss. I'm going to get to the ed policy concerns that I think Manip would bring up, but I also want to bring up at the larger context what COVID and the pandemic is really saying about public policy in general for immigrant families. I think that's super important. So if we look at that larger context, we're talking about one of the most unstable times for employment, food security, housing for immigrant families, on top of deportations and a real attack on our immigrant families. And I think that we're going to have to be creative about the civil rights promise of education, of public education to Latino students within that context of also human rights around immigrant rights, work, and food. And I mentioned that because I was watching a webinar with Ed Trust, who's run by the past Secretary of Education under Barack Obama, John King. And I love that he mentioned that first before we get to ed policy, because this is such a monumentous time in terms of huge unemployment and impact on the economy. And who's getting the worst of it is our immigrant Latino families. So I want to mention that first. And I think all of us as advocates and whoever's listening should say, well, first we need this, right? We need food security. We need security from fear as an immigrant. And we also need to think about the housing issues. And then secondly, the main issues I'm concerned about in the fall for Latino families specifically is, what does safety look like? How do Latino families address this issue of their children now being exposed to other children? And, is there some sort of information campaign, public health campaign in Spanish that can go viral to impact families' understanding of what those different models, as Antonio's talking about. We want them to get a better education, but we also want them to be safe. So what's the best for Latino families, and how can they hear that information in their language and cultural reference? The second area is definitely keeping high expectations for our EL learners. You know, folks, to be honest, all around this country in Minnesota, our English language learners, or we like to call our emerging multilingual learners, we're not getting the best education. We're not getting equitable education. We have laws in place. We have the LEAPS Act in Minnesota that really should guarantee that teachers are more culturally responsive. They use native language as an asset for them to learn the second language, and just more conscious of culture and language in terms of teaching. That's not happening in the classroom or on distance learning. So we're going to be really concerned about that practice improving and some more PD for educators to get that right. And then the third area I'd say is, what about students who are now having to work on behalf of for their families? So get creative about work policy for high school age youth. There are policies that are being proposed for that. And it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, like, no, we don't want kids to work, we want them to be in school. You know what, we can be creative about that for students. I'm sure Katie can speak more to that topic, but we really have to think about that with our Latino learners.
Yeah. Is it am I yeah. Yes, Jennifer, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I had a student call me today, concerned that they were getting behind, and they're like, I wake up at 6 to help my mom cook, and we go and sell food, because we lost our jobs. And so, yeah, we're trying to get as much support as we can. So it's like, okay, what time? And so literally carved out, like, this is, like Antonio's saying, like, student-centered. Here's your plan. Here's what works for you. And we're going to make it happen. Like, let's check in at 5 o'clock then and take poquito, right? Like, we don't think of all your classes. Let's just start with what we'll keep getting there. Now we have that advantage, especially as many charter schools, and especially the colegio, that we're smaller. And so we do know all of our students, even though I'll argue I'm still getting to know all of our students since I was just in the beginning, but all of our staff overall know all of our students. And I think that is absolutely key in order to get through this distance learning even more. And so I'm empathetic, but yet then I'm like, what are you guys going to do in the bigger districts, because they have such a huge population and needs to meet, but that we still have to do it. You know what I mean? But yes, the work is a huge thing. And, the other part of unemployment for students who lost work, well, they don't qualify for unemployment unless they drop out. So it's like, there's all these weird things that are showing up in our laws that I think weren't intentional, right? I don't think that was like someone said, I want these kids to fail necessarily, but the times have changed. And so we need to get up to speed and adapt and change to what is the real need right now more than ever.
Thank you. Thank you all for your perspective on that. I think two of the questions that we actually have received, I want to kind of like weave them in because it's just like perfect for the conversation. And thinking about these challenges, before we continue on this long term, like what happens next? What, maybe Antonio, start with you on this one. What can community education organizations do to help support schools and the Latinx community?
It's a good question. I think coordination of services to any degree is going to be really, really helpful, because I think it can be really challenging when, people are trying to do things on their own or as one-offs. And, we were actually on a team call earlier today with, PUC leadership around, how do we build stronger partnerships and collaborations with other organizations? Because like nobody can do it all on their own, right? I know that on the front end of the pandemic, there's a lot of food justice related organizations, that really kind of like stepped up, started doing a lot of things. But then there was also a lot of like crisscrossing that happened as people were trying to do it. So, that's a natural thing that's going to happen. But I think kind of taking what's happened within food systems and figuring out how to apply it to other things, whether it's like employment assistance, whether it's even just like, is there a system to set up for like our elderly community to like go pick up groceries and, you know, do drop offs? I think there's just a lot of that that still needs to get figured out. And, you know, I think avoiding competition as much as possible, I think is going to be really important.
Katie, I know you have partnerships, quite extensive partnerships throughout the community. So maybe talk a little bit about how you partner with community organizations, or like how can schools better partner, on the flip end, how can schools better partner with community organizations to help the community?
Yeah, and I appreciate this question, because actually, like maybe it was earlier this week, or just especially as we're looking at grants and planning for next year. I think right when we went into distance learning, like all of our minds just shifted, and we're like, what do we have to do? What do we need to do? Like, okay, you're gonna go bring food to this house, you're gonna do this, you're gonna teach this lesson. You know, we just all went into like action. And now, like sitting back and being in a reflective mode, I think that I'm like, okay, we need to also be working strategically and working together. But I mean, we have been working with different organizations, even with our food. You know, the Sheridan Story drops off food weekly to us, and we're able to utilize that to bring to our families. We work with some other folks in different cities who've been providing some produce to our school that we've been able to set up and set outside and hand out to families, the whole community, not just a colegio, right? So not just making sure we're meeting the needs of everybody in the community, since we're a community school in that sense. But I think long term, we need to start pulling together and strategically, you know, go to your site or you come to our site, et cetera, right? So we're not competing against each other. And I don't think anyone is in the mindset of competing, but as we know that this is going to be long term, we also need to start pulling our resources together and being, because we also are a school, and we can't, you know, we can't sustain just the three of us always doing the same things, right? So I think there's just definitely an opportunity for us to really engage more with our community-based organizations in a different way, right? Before maybe it was doing services, but now it's like, okay, how can we together meet the needs of our community?
Thank you. Jennifer, just again, the same question. Thoughts on how can community organizations and schools actually support each other better?
Yeah, again, from the angle of MANEEP's research and analysis, we are hearing more from the Department of Education in Minnesota about some collaborations that got set up pretty quickly and successfully. And so I would just point you to, you know, if you can get on the MDE website, and there's information about those models for those who are listening and want to build a stronger partnership, whether you're on the CBO side or on the school district side. I believe that MDE will have some more examples, but I don't have them at the top of my head. From the way, again, the perspective we have on these issues right now is that research and policy end of it.
Okay. So, and shifting gears a little bit, so a little bit more tactical or operations. Katie, I think I'll start with you. We have a couple of questions here on special education for Latino students in these times of COVID. And so I think it'd be helpful to talk about like what maybe you have identified as gaps and how you all are serving your special ed population right currently.
Yeah, it is. It's hard. I think stamina. I think, you know, our teachers, you know, they're meeting with them at, yes, the scheduled times, but also at other times. Our EAs, our educational assistants, are reaching out and trying to help in like that tutor mode. Like, what do you need? We've given them all the different devices that they need, but then they just, it's like exhausting to be on the devices all day, right? Like, that's not what they're used to. And, you know, our therapists from OTs and speech, and everyone's trying to be creative, and whether it's via telehealth or social distance meeting to just, you know, check in, etc. It's hard. And I think we, you know, in conversations I've had, I think I will say my teachers and staff are doing a great job, but then I think when we are self-reflecting, we're like, we need to do better. We need to be more creative. And even as we were planning for summer school, because there's that conversation of like, oh, they're exhausted, but it's like at the same time, we still need to keep meeting their needs and meeting the IEP goals and thinking it through a different way, but really just feeling them out too, right? Like maybe it's not going to be as long a day, so adjusting in those pieces. Again, I think that I can probably sound like repeated, but we are smaller, so we have that advantage of that ratio to teacher to student to be reaching them. But there are a few that I think we're struggling to meet their needs because they're kind of like giving up. They're like, yeah, this is too much, you know? And we're not okay with that, but so how do we reach out to them? So there's some greats that we're doing, and then there's some struggles that we're really trying to be honest and reflective and what we need to do better for the summer and the school year to come.
If I could say something about special education, just from what we've heard from the department, and again, don't quote me, I'm not a public spokesperson for MDE, but I heard great concern in terms of making sure that educators, districts understood their responsibility in serving students. And so I think that's also from one end, the need to figure out how educators could possibly do the 6 feet distancing and be in a classroom in case some of that has to be improved through the summer time. So I would check in with the department in terms of what special education technical services should be provided to your district if something's not being met, because they are concerned about students not getting their rights met.
Yep.
Antonio, I'm not sure if this has been a topic of conversations within, the PUC portfolio at all, but any thoughts on gaps that you've seen or learned from with respect to special education of Latino students?
I don't know if I would say like special, like for me specifically around special education, but I do think about like more like alternative school kids in this. So for example, like so my brother is educational assistant. He works in the district in Albert Lee, so most of my family all lives in Albert Lee, Minnesota. And I think for a little bit different than when I was growing up, when there was only kind of a handful of mostly Mexican families in Albert Lee. Like every other rural community in Minnesota, the browning has been happening pretty quickly. And so the Albert Lee School District, there's a large Latino population that's there. And so his students that he works with are all alternative high school students, and a lot of them are Latino kids. And so his challenge has been, figuring out like what is the right level of kind of communication that you try to have with students, because I think, not even just in this space, but I think for all of us, we've been wrestling with, we want to make sure that we're, like Jennifer said, fulfilling our responsibilities. We want to make sure that we're providing services for kids, that we're actively, communicating. But then at the same time, we want to make sure that we're, acting out of a certain sense of grace and not overwhelming students, and, being sensitive to their lived experience. And so for him, I was talking to him a couple weekends ago, and asking him like how his communication with his students have been going. So he'll open his computer in the morning, send his, initial, good morning emails, do you have any questions? And then for the first few hours, he doesn't hear anything. And then he might hear, there might be some trickling that comes in. And so it's a challenge. I mean, there is also a thing around like broadband access there too. And that, internet in Albert Lee is not the strongest. And so if you're just kind of like using your mobile device as your hotspot, that's not a very, adequate connection all the time. So there's a tension.
Thanks for bringing up just the really large issue that has been a consistent part of the conversation with respect to access to technology, not only just the Chromebooks, laptops, but also like the broadband and the hotspots. So Jennifer, I'd just be curious if you can talk a little bit about your experience, and even like how, like the scope of the issue, in terms of how challenging it has been for Latino families to access, the internet, broadband, but also the computers and Chromebooks, and that is true.
Yeah, I think I'll be just right up front honest. I think you all are going to get more data about that as you talk to families. We're just understanding it from town halls and from knowing it, again, I'm connected to the colegio community, knowing what's going on there. The Worthington community, as we all know, faces horrific COVID breakout in terms of the plant, the meatpacking plant. And so talking to some of the advocates there who connect to Latino communities, they're like, school, we're worried about like this survival. And so again, just thinking about that intersection between workers' rights, Latino families, and then education, we're going to have to be working on both ends at the same time. That's really my strongest concern about Latinos during distance learning during COVID.
Gotcha. Katie, can you talk a little bit about what you did at El Colegio to ensure that the students immediately had access to technology, and like what lift that was to make sure at least your students did receive those technology?
So before, when we still had our students here, we surveyed them to see, and it was a pretty intense survey to ask them, do you have a laptop? Do you share it with people? Do you have a tablet? Do you have Wi-Fi? Is it paid monthly? Like kind of just to get as many details as possible before they left us. And that helped inform us to see what the first set of need was. And then we were able to fundraise, we were able to get some grants, and we just went and got 30 Chromebooks and about 20 hotspots for our students. And it's been like every week it's like, okay, now there's 2 more students who need hotspots, because then some of it is, I had internet in March and then I lost my job and now I don't have it in April. Or they thought, students too, kind of learning, oh, well, I have data, you know what I mean? Not understanding all those differences between Wi-Fi versus data, et cetera. And then when you have multiple people in your house using one Chromebook, then they're like, oh, maybe I do need my own Chromebook. Or you have multiple people using the Wi-Fi, oh, we do need extra support. So those things along the line happen. But like I said earlier, we do weekly food drop-offs to our families who are asked for it and who need it. I should say not asked for it, those who we've reached out to and told us that they do need it. And then we also ask them in those same questions, how are you doing with technology? Is that a need at all? And so then we compiled those lists. We delivered Chromebooks and computers along with the food, or if they just needed Chromebooks, or some needed classroom materials. And even now we still deliver classroom materials more like every other week. There are different worksheets to help some of our students with IEPs. And so that's really what we did. And it's still, even last week we were still delivering different Chromebooks to students who needed it. So I think it's because we consistently ask the same question. I know the prior executive director here, Norma, who I have a lot of respect for, she always said, you guys say it 7 times, ask it 7 times, and you start to get those answers. So we're not just asking once and saying, oh, they told us they were good. We're constantly checking in and making sure they have what they need for their distance learning.
So in addition to the technology that you did provide, can you talk about a little bit about the learning curve that some of the students and families had to go through to be able to utilize the systems effectively and efficiently to get what you needed them to do? Part of the challenge we've heard in conversations with, cultural liaisons, paras, is that, okay, so there's the technology that was provided, for those that were, that were provided those, but the learning curve that followed.
Yep. So at El Colegio, they had already started this school year using Google Classroom in the fall. So, I mean, way before COVID or knowing that this was going to happen. So they already were being exposed to it. And even our families like had been learning how they can check grades and things like that. So there already was like some pre-learning done in general at the school. And then when we're making those calls, and sometimes it is, they're like, you know, I dropped off food one time to one of my students, and I said, "Oh, did you check in? Yeah, I got the assignment. Do I just email the answers back?" You know, there was some of those like quick learning curves that we take for granted, right? And it's like, yep, here's what you need to do. So I think I'm very grateful for our staff who do the daily calls, because they are sometimes that first responder in the education realm of like, here's how you got to do it, or go to this site. Our teachers have been amazing trying to learn how to teach online and be innovative and utilize new skills that they, one, probably would say they don't necessarily like, but they're doing a good job in. And then they're being patient and showing the students how to do things, you know. Today, this week, our seniors had senior presentations that they were doing online, and, you know, doing their Google slideshow, learning how to present. For the couple weeks prior, we've been practicing with them and showing them how to through this distance model. So I think it's just really comes down to communicating and that showing, really working on those the high skills essentially that work for all of our students.
Antonio, I'm not sure if if you've heard some of the challenges from, you know, some of the directors with respect to like a slow start to really being able to get to be able to access like what they need, like what students and families need to access to be able to participate in distance learning. I'm not sure if that's, you know, I don't know if that has come a part of the discussion.
No, I mean, I think if I think broadly about, you know, the 20 schools, I think almost all of them feel comfortable with their ability to respond and get technology. And that's of course a different thing than what Katie's talking about, the learning curve, and like do the students actually understand all of the, you know, capabilities and, you know, things that, you know, they need to do with it. I mean, I'll be honest, like, you know, we got a Chromebook for the office here, and it literally took me like 4 hours to try to figure out like how this, you know, thing works. So I can only imagine, you know, what it's like for, you know, a kid to do that. So I mean, I think they all jumped pretty quickly, invested resources into getting the hardware and hotspots, and then, you know, I think they're still working through that learning curve.
Okay. So in thinking about, so in appreciating the unknown, right? Come September, how do educators even prepare on how to work with and through those challenges? I know Katie, you mentioned it a little bit, but maybe you can just you know, give a higher level of what do you anticipate as some of the challenges coming into or going into the next school year?
That's a big question. There's a lot. Yeah, because so much is unknown. I was going to say one other thing too, just to back up to the last question. And even though I didn't get to go to my training yet because of COVID, but one thing that El Colegio has done well is working on those E3 skills and really finding our students in the beginning of the school year when they join El Colegio, learn their 21st century skills that they already have. And so I know like in a lot of our conversations, we're always telling them, you already know how to do this. Let's be creative, be adaptive. So I don't know. I feel like since that's already been ingrained in our culture here at El Colegio, even though we got hit with this and we're in trauma, we also know and have some skills of resiliency to get out. So sorry, I just wanted to add that. And then for that previous question. So now looking ahead, it's hard to know because there's a lot of unknowns and making plans, 3 different plans as a school of continuing distance learning. Okay, we can probably, that might be a little bit easier of a plan because we're already in it and we know what we want to do better. And then there's what happens in this hybrid model, because there's all types of consequences that can happen in a hybrid, even as we start talking when we're discussing summer. some of our students might be the caretakers of their younger siblings. So if we say come at this hour or this day of the week, but then their younger ones are at home alone, like how does that all flush out? So we have to be conscious of all the dominoes that can fall into different places with all of us collaborating as educators and charters and traditional districts to figure this out. And then what would it look like when we do come back on site? Looking at space, if we have to have, a square foot of 36 feet around everybody, like how do you make that manageable? So I think those are some things. I think there's going to be a lot of added expenses with technology because many schools who are purchase Chromebooks, you still gotta upkeep those Chromebooks even maybe a little bit more because they're not in our building locked up every night, and then the continuous pay for hotspots. And then the PD and learning how to teach in a different way is it's exhausting. There's some excitement, right? Because we already knew that I think the other part is it's an opportunity for us to really transform and change things that we knew that weren't already working. So there's opportunities there. And I try to stay focused on that positive piece of it. Like, okay, it's time for us to really be innovative and the things that we knew that weren't working before, like more than ever, we got to make change or otherwise no estamos haciendo nada.
I wanted to build off of that. I think that everybody's been talking about how all of our institutions are transforming, and we're understanding that we're not reaching everybody equitably, and we understand those deep inequities a little bit better than ever before. And so if we're talking about more student-centered learning, more cultural responsiveness, and racial equity, truly having a racial justice framework for public education, this is a time to learn from the Katies. This is a time to lift up El Colegio, all of our Latino liaisons. I've seen some beautiful presentations just on Twitter from public school Latina liaisons who put together Spanish explanations for the parents on how to use the devices. And so we need to tell, I'm going to be very blunt here. We got to tell our white educators, this is what's going to save our public education system. You need to learn these ways. We believe in your humanity, so believe in our humanity in terms of using language and culture to better reach students. These students want to learn, families want to learn. They just need a more culturally competent system and more racially equitable system in order to learn. We also have an opportunity to do dual family literacy. We've been talking about how we want Latino families to also improve their education skills. So if we have care funding, we have monies to provide technology trainings this summer or in the fall, we should do that with the families as well. So those are just two elements I want to build off of Katie's point that we can transform education by learning through this time.
Antonio, from an authorizer's perspective, what are you hoping, or maybe walk that back, how are you hoping schools and educators prepare for working through these challenges or even thinking about this, given the unknowns?
I mean, that's kind of the daily question that we wrestle with, right? I mean, I think the thing for me is, I want to continue to encourage schools to be creative, thoughtful, and responsive. I mean, I think the challenge that we have is, and I think to Jennifer's point, a lot of the conversations that people have been having are like, yeah, we have this broad recognition that systems have not worked forever. And, we're seeing them change just by necessity. And we want to continue to change them in an intentional way that are more responsive to like the needs that we have. But I think, and I think at the beginning of this, just because by human nature, like we want to have a sense of control. And so because everything was like so chaotic at the beginning, there was this flurry of like Zooms and conversations and things about like education transformation and like, how do we do this thing? And then I think it like kind of like tapered off as people started to settle into the daily reality of like, what are the things that we actually have to tactically do to continue to serve our students? And so, now I think what, I'm hearing from school leaders is they're starting to look back towards like, the Department of Education, other entities to provide them with a lot of guidance on how to do the things. And I think it's really important to have guidance, but I would be hesitant to go too far that direction where we look to somebody else to give us the answers versus trying to have that level of flexibility and creativity that I think at the beginning people were looking for.
So we've got
the one other thing that I would add, because I think the challenge here though too is like the tension of like not having guidance is we don't want to then create more equity issues because if schools are allowed to be maybe too flexible, you know, there's going to be kids that go overlooked.
So we're just closing in on time here. So I think we'll do just one more question. And again, with appreciating the unknowns, one question that has been raised a couple of times to me now, and I'd be curious to hear from you all, is how you start thinking about it. Like, what should parents be looking for as they are considering where they will be sending their child next year? So that's like pre-K, middle school, high school. Katie?
Well, which hat do I put on as a mother of 4 children and a leader of a school? I really think the work needs to be meaningful. There's a lot of like I think we get so stuck in this traditional way of teaching, like it has to be this way, or it has to be 7 subjects, 7 different ways, like we've been talking at El Colegio with our teachers looking at project-based learning. So this summer, like we're trying to be creative. So it's like, here's a project with these standards met, and that's going to count for these 2 credits in these 2 different classes or whatnot, as a simplistic way to say it. So I think as a parent, and knowing when you're looking at your schools, how are they meeting the needs of your child? Are they providing you access to whatever type of program that they have, whether that's through technology, and then of the assignments that they're giving, is it meaningful? And I don't say busy work to like discredit what teachers do, like in any sense of the way, but it's like we really got to look. These are the standards. This is what they need to learn. In what ways, in livable and things in your house, can you learn that skill, right? Like we really need to challenge ourselves to think like that. And I have a lot of friends who are teachers, and sometimes we get in a little bit of arguments about that, because I'm sensitive when I say that, because I don't think that everyone's heart isn't in the right place, but we also need to just step back and reflect. This is what we want them to know. It doesn't mean it has to be, behind the chalkboard or in my classroom. Like there's other ways to learn that, and we need to challenge ourselves even more now on how we're going to meet those needs. So as a parent, those are what you want to see. At least me as a parent, like I want to see how my school is, yes, engaging, but also making work meaningful, I guess, is like the best way that I can say it.
I know we have very little time, but I just want to stress with parents, and I want to say this in Spanish. Lo que hemos estado viviendo es algo bien fuerte. Por favor, cuídense mucho, cuidan a sus hijos. Lo que están haciendo es exactamente lo que tienen que hacer, es cuidar a sus hijos. Como dice la maestra Katie, hay cosas que están aprendiendo de ustedes. Están aprendiendo la paciencia. Están aprendiendo cómo ver las noticias y no asustarnos, pero saber las cosas para protegernos como comunidad. Con eso, los maestros y el sistema les tienen que ayudar a ustedes. Entonces, nosotros estamos empujando al sistema que tengan más prioridad de lo cultural en enseñar a sus hijos. Pero si ustedes les dan buena comida, buena casa, ese tipo de salud mental, van a hacer mucho en el otoño, porque eso es lo base. So the most basic thing families can do is give them support, love, good meals, do the basics, because that's the other part of educational success. That is why I am here. Tengo una familia que no tenía recursos, pero siempre tenían amor. With that, I hope you all do very well this summer.
Yes.
Antonio, just offer the final word on this for you. What should parents be looking for? Where are they going to send their kids to school?
I mean, I think in this environment, the one thing that I would say is does the school have a clearly articulated plan of what they're going to do?
Mhm.
And then the second thing that's not just for this, but all the time, do the adults in the building treat you in a respectful way?
Thank you. Thank you all. I can't tell you how much we appreciate this conversation. So folks that are listening in, please feel free to reach out to me, samantha.diaz@state.mn.us. If we weren't able to answer your questions, again, panelists, thank you for this thoughtful discussion. I really appreciate it. Thank you all.